Hello, friends, and welcome to the Interworld podcast, where we explore the intersection of personal and collective transformation. My name is Yasha S. Wagner, and I'm a PhD researcher in the field of psychology, well-being, and spirituality, and the founder of the Interworld Institute for Inner World Peace. You can learn more about our nonprofit initiatives by going to interworld.org. Today I have the great honor of speaking with my friend Mariam, whose spiritual name is Sindhu Dasi. And Mariam is a teacher of Atma Kriya Yoga, an Om chanting facilitator, and is also a devotee of Paramahamsa Vishwananda. Mariam has also spent years connecting with the indigenous traditions of the Americas and actually welcomed the first planting of both the Mayan and Wixarika fires that we know of on the Arabian Peninsula. Today, Mariam is joining us from her home in Dubai, which is very exciting. So we are actually recording today's episode from opposite ends of the planet. And without further ado, here's our interview with Mariam. Hi, Mariam. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, nice to be in touch.
Yeah, thanks for joining. How are you today?
Good. I find it quite funny that it's your bedtime and it's our sunrise. So it's nice.
Yeah, it's actually perfectly aligned. Like the sun is going down here and coming up there right as we started. So it's fascinating. So I know that we have plenty of rich topics to explore today, which I'm very happy about, and lots of fun synchronicities as well. But I just want to start by inviting you to share more about yourself, your work in the world, and your own backstory, like your journey that brought you to this work. I know that the bio didn't really sum it up. So if you want to share more, I'd love to hear all about it.
Sure, yeah. So I'm from this tiny little country in the Middle East, the United Arab Emirates, which when I was born, if you see the sort of the skyline in 92 was complete sort of desert, a building popping up here and there. And over the span of my sort of first 2 decades, actually up to date still, the country's transformed completely and the culture here has opened up a lot to the West. And ever since I was very little, my parents always thought it was very important for us to get to know different traditions and know about different ways. And from a very sort of more boring perspective, I studied philosophy in the UK and I did a master's in gender studies. And all of that in my life was sort of bringing me to a point where I was trying to understand myself a little bit more. And it took me up to a place where I was doing a study of transpersonal counseling and psychology with a teacher here in the UAE after my university degree. And I was really trying to kind of get to, I guess, like I felt there wasn't something that had clicked in my life. There was lots of pieces that weren't working. And eventually I got deep into this study of transpersonal counseling and it's giving an understanding of healing and therapy, but from a transpersonal perspective, which is taking into account not just the psychological, but also very much what has been somatized and what's also happening on more of a spiritual level. And so in that, the teacher brought in different elements. So, there was dance, there was Kundalini yoga. And I started getting into my practice. It was the first time that I did a yoga or a practice that really locked in for me. And I saw just some rapid transformation in my life take place. And from there, I studied to become a teacher of Kundalini yoga. And then it's like this box of treasures opened up on my path, and all of these different wonders came into place for me. And since then, I've had the great blessing to meet my teacher, Paramahamsa Vishwananda. and go onto the path of Bhakti, and kind of I have my teeth in deep right now with like all the knowledge and all of that side of things. So that's pretty much my life. But in the midst of that, there was a cross pollination of different traditions. I studied with the indigenous in the Americas, and I also studied with a women's shamanic lineage in England that works with the serpent and the honeybee. So that was a good, it ended up being much more than 5 years because of COVID, but it was a good couple of years of my life with that kind of embodied work and embodied practice. And there was the Buddhist tradition and lots of different things that came in as well. So yeah, here we are.
Wow, so many different influences. I can definitely relate to that, and I think that's becoming more and more the reality of our times. So, and I actually wanted to ask you to elaborate more on some of the other traditions that you encountered, such as your work with indigenous traditions. And I think we'll come back to that more deeply later on in the episode. But if you want to give a few quick examples for now, I think that might be interesting just to hear.
Sure. Yeah, so, I think we both know the Mayan tradition, the Mayan altar from Guatemala. I was very lucky to meet them through our mutual community that we met through. And um, it's just been a really nice bridging with the culture here. Not to go too much into too many other traditions, but just to say, like, when we go into the depth of these traditions, there's so many parallels with my culture, for example. So having them here has really like brought up like a lot of similarity in some sense of how the altar works, how the community, like the value and the principle. But yeah, I spent time with Plum Village, like the monks, brothers and sisters of Plum Village, and at their monastery, actually upstate as well, Blue Cliff Monastery. And I spent a lot of time as well with the Amazonians. That's how sort of it picked up. Was my first sort of toe in was with a tribe from the Brazilian Amazon. And yeah.
Can I ask what the tribe was in Brazil?
Sure, it was the Yawanawa.
Okay.
It was, now they're quite well known, I guess, internationally, yeah. At least in our circles. But back in the day, in 2018, it was some of the family members' first tours in Europe. Wow. And I happened to speak a little Portuguese because I had done capoeira when I was at university. And so, there was no one speaking Portuguese there. So it was like a bit of a point of relation and comfort for them because, they were in this completely new environment and surrounded by like 50 people that were, super interested in their culture, and they'd just come out for the first times. So it was, it was nice. Yeah.
You're reminding me of such a funny story. I think, is it Tony Moss? Do you know who I'm talking about? He's like the leader of the bird tribe community in California. And but anyways, he's Tony Moss, I think is the name. There was this gathering in Paonia, Colorado many years ago. It might have been as early as what you're saying, like 2018, something like this. And he was telling this story there about the Yawanawa, that's how you say it, Yawanawa tribe. And it was the funniest story. He said he was at like the World Aya Forum or something. It was like the conference for indigenous medicines, and all these different, tribes and facilitators and people were there representing, and he was attending. And he said that there were like 3 different tribal representatives from the Yawanawa tribe. And the way he told the story, he was like, on the first day, one of these elders went on stage and he was like, I just want to clear something up once and for all, how it's pronounced. It's Yawanawa. And then every next day he was like, I swear to God, the next one from the tribe went up and he did it too, but they all put the emphasis on a different syllable. So anyways, I guess now you're clearing it up for us.
I mean, I can't say that I'm an authority to, on the pronunciation of that term in the slightest, but
Well, apparently, if we trust Tony, then none of them are either, because there might be some disagreement. I don't know. Yeah. I'm kidding, though. I don't really know how it works. So anyways, I think that we'll come back to indigenous traditions from the Americas later. I just want to kind of dive right into your main area of expertise, which I know relates to the traditions of yoga. And I think since this is an educational podcast, it's meant to be, it would be great to just start with some basics of like big picture context. Obviously, everyone might in a modern world think that we know what yoga is, but maybe somebody who actually has dedicated their life to finding out what yoga is might not even know what it is, but maybe you can help illuminate for us some context of what yoga means in your experience and understanding of the tradition and the context.
Sure, it's such a broad subject, really. I mean, at the core of it, yoga is union. And then it's the idea of like union with what? Union with who? I guess that's the key question that we want to approach with the understanding of yoga. Now in our modern day, yoga is very much understood, and it is its own standing right as very much as a physical practice. But traditionally, the physical component of yoga is minute, what's spoken about in the ancient scriptures. And if we look at the Bhagavad Gita, for example, which is this text, I know you're very familiar, 5,000 years ago, conversation on the battlefield of Kurukshetra between Lord Krishna and Arjuna, the definition of yoga is very salient there. And, we go through the journey of the yogas. And starting off, first of all, Lord Krishna says, in order to, live a good life, it's good to practice karma yoga, which is to act in the world, but not to be attached to the fruits of the actions. He says, chapter 2, verse 47, you have the right to act. Sometimes we think, oh, I'm engaging in a spiritual path. I need to go and isolate myself. I need to go and live in a very remote place. And he's saying, no, you have the right to act in the world, but you do not have the right to the fruits of the action. So it's just that first teaching with karma yoga of like how I can act, but I have I'm not entitled to the benefits of that, and I shouldn't be attached to the benefits of it. So karma yoga is very powerful, a very good way of practicing in our day-to-day that has nothing to do with getting on a mat. It may be harder because we have to live it in every day, in each moment. And then he goes into jnana yoga, which is the yoga of knowledge. And so some people understand it as coming through scriptural study and through, really knowing the philosophy, knowing the scripture, and really meditating and contemplating that. But jnana yoga is actually very deep. It's the subject of knowing oneself. It's knowing who we are in truth and going beyond all of the misconceptions of identification with the body, with the mind, with this reality and the attachment we put onto it, and going deeper into the knowing of the truth. And, we go a little bit further in the Bhagavad Gita, and Lord Krishna says, actually, the highest of all yogas, and I think that is the key of I mean, there's many keys, but there's the main key of the Bhagavad Gita. And, I speak of the scripture because it is a foundational text in Vedic philosophy. That is, you can study the same, it's only 700-ish verses. You can go into it every single day. That's a practice that we have in our traditions. You pick a verse and you let it sort of simmer. And the Bhagavad Gita speaks of the Bhakti yoga as the highest. And it says, you can do, all of these different things of like detaching from the action, contemplating on the self. Actually, they're important. You have to do them to grow spiritually. However, there's no point if you are just focused on the self. All of those, this karma and jnana yoga can get you to self-realization, getting to know who you are as a soul. But in the Bhagavad Gita, it also says, like, who is the soul of that soul? It's Bhagavan, it's the Lord. And so bhakti is that relationship. It's the surrender of my ideas of who I am, what I want, and, what I can attain, but a complete reliance on God through that surrendered, loving relationship. Something that comes hand in hand with Bhakti, and we can speak about this a little bit more, is the notion of seva, is selfless service, selflessness as well. So it's really focused on love, surrender, and true service. And yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell, like yoga, as I understand it anyway.
Yeah, beautiful. So just to recap, my understanding is that the word yoga, when you say it, basically means union. It relates to this root of yug. And I don't know if it's the same root as the word to yoke, but my understanding is that's part of how that's explained in terms of union, like yoking, like yug, yoga. And then you're pointing out for us, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that there's generally presented like 4 main paths of karma, jnana, raja, and bhakti yoga. Is that right? And then so karma, action without attachment to the fruits of the action. So it's not renunciation of action, but it's action with renunciation of your own attachment to the results. And then jnana, knowledge, not just study, but that's a part of it. But then it's also like almost like a gnosis, like a knowing, jnana. And then bhakti is this relational devotion, surrender, loving, seva, selfless service. Right. Okay, that's good. And we didn't speak too much about Raja, but I know the word Raja essentially relates to king. But my understanding is that it's kind of like a meditative absorption or like a being yoga, or practice of that sort. Yeah.
Yeah, Raja Yoga, it's very intertwined with the Kriya Yoga lineages. Actually, Kriya, as we understand it traditionally, is Raja Yogic, practice, at least Kundalini Yoga. And we can go there if you want.
Yeah, please go.
Yeah, so Raja Yoga, there's this ancient lineage yogic practice of, for example, Kundalini Kriya comes from the Sikh tradition. And it's the understanding that these Kriyas, they were kept very secret and they were given intergenerationally to specific royal lineages. But of course, in nowadays and age, the practice isn't necessarily just for the royal lineages, but also to connect us to that inner kind of aspect of Raj. And it's connected to the 10th body in Kundalini Yoga, which is the radiant body. And so it's a very powerful way. There were some families, for example, they would have to practice the same Kriya for 7 generations in order to get the next step. And so we can't trace back how far and long, these studies are. And what we have access to nowadays in this time, this Kali Yuga, where we're so detached from our true nature, is just sort of like a very watered down version of what, what these lineages and what these yogas signified and held. I can't even do it justice by explaining it at all. But it's what's pertinent in these times. It always comes back to like the culmination in bhakti, which is kind of like the goal of all the yogas is to get you to that place where you are purified enough that you can then have that relationship with the divine.
Well, we will definitely explore both Kriya, Atma Kriya, and Bhakti Yoga a lot more here in a sec. I'm really curious, do you know, because I don't remember the exact word, but do you know this word? I think it's Purushruta. What is it?
Purushottama? Or Purusha?
It's it's about the aims, the proper aims in life. Are you familiar with that one?
Purusharthas.
Yes. I think that's it. Purusharthas. I couldn't get the pronunciation. And I know that moksha is just one of them, and then there's aims related to abundance, related to enjoyment, related to dharma, to your duty. So it's like all all three of those and moksha. And the reason I bring it up is because those purusharthas, or aims, kind of demonstrate what you're saying about karma yoga, I think, which is that they point out that there's different phases we go through, different priorities we need to acknowledge, and that there are things related to our well-being, to our duties, to our family, to our prosperity and our enjoyment of life, and all of these things are valid. So that's where this part of this idea of like action, but with the selflessness as a part of that.
Sure.
It's and I know that that's a whole nother exploration I've just been studying recently, and this idea of like the ashramas and periods of life and of the day, and how we use our energy towards those aims. So if you want to elaborate on any of that and kind of illumine the areas that I'm clearly only have a little bit of information about, you could.
Yeah, because we have to look at the context of yoga in the Vedic culture, right? Some people say like, oh no, yoga has this origin, but if you look at the sort of the depths of it, it's in its richest expression in Sanatana Dharma. It's in its original expression in Sanatana Dharma. That's where the teachings sort of originate from. Not sort of. That's where, in my understanding, their root is. Of course, I know different traditions have their different yogas. I remember practicing some form of Mayan yoga, but the core of like what we understand philosophically is from there, and so it's intertwined very much with the layout of the culture. And so there's like this sort of ground rules and the dharma of how one should pan out their life. But if you look at the different ashramas, for example, in my tradition, in the Haribhakta Sampradaya, for example, you can be very young and not be a householder. You can be a very, very young person and be brahmachari already, be a renunciate, renounce family life. And so it doesn't have to be it's not necessarily linear. Or you might have a tendency in your capacity, in your nature, for example, to be very attached to material enjoyment. So in that sense, you would focus a little bit differently if you're trying to strive spiritually, right? So the focuses would be a little bit different. Yeah.
Interesting. So Atma Kriya. You started to explain Kriya. I would really love to be educated on Kriya Yoga in general. And maybe you can just build an understanding from the ground up for us, aside from what you already started to share, of Kriya and Atma Kriya in particular, and what it is that you're actually teaching and where that's coming from and so on.
Sure. Yeah. So Kriya Yoga, essentially, Kriya means action. Kriya comes from the Himalayas. All Kriya usually is associated to an immortal saint called Mahavatar Babaji. It's this practice that combines movement, breath, mantra, and meditation. And some practices have an initiatic component as well, which means that it really switches on this capacity to go very deep into the practice. I'm sure many people listening will have heard of the autobiography of a yogi. So that's amazing. I love the scripture. It changed my life. But essentially, this traditional form of Kriya being brought out to the West for the first time in the early 1900s. And previously, it was, just as we speak about Raja Yoga, it's the secret capacity, it's the secrecy of like preserving these things for a specific, not caste, I mean, in the way that we understand it, but to like those who are deeply spiritually seeking, because it's of such a high nectar, it's of such a high gift that unless you've devoted your life, it's sort of this understanding that A, you won't be able to focus properly, you have kids, you have other things going on, and B, it's kind of like this question of like, are you worthy to receive these teachings? I don't know if that's the core of it, but in our day and age, of course, it's in the public. So you can Google about Kriya, you can learn about Kriya online, and it's a totally different ballgame. And I think it's important that it was brought out. I think that was the master's wishes, that it was shared with Lahiri Mahashaya's story. If you read that book, how he was told, like, go share it with householders, don't share it with the average guy. And so now, so there's that wave that came in, there's lots of kriyas that were shared and different interpretations and adaptations. And Paramahamsa Vishwananda, my guru, he was given the instruction by Mahavatar Babaji to bring out Atma Kriya Yoga, the specific kind of yoga. And he actually refused for many years. He negotiated with Babaji. He said, no, the people are not ready for this. And no, like, that's not, my focus. And Babaji kind of insisted. And Guruji eventually said to him, okay, I will share Kriya with people as long as you let me bring back this ancient healing technique of Om chanting. And so back and forth, and then Babaji says, okay. So he says, okay. So he initiated people, I think it was in like the start of the 2000s, maybe 2008 or something like that. That was his first courses on Atma Kriya. It has 5 levels. Most people I know only get to the first 2. Practice that isn't Raja Yoga, it isn't a karma, it is pure Bhakti Yoga. Most Kriya Yogas I wouldn't call Bhakti Yoga, but in this, it is very unique in the sense that Atma Kriya Yoga, it awakens the 9 forms of Bhakti. So each technique isn't just to get sort of, your karma. It has immense benefits, like the amount of karma that it clears and the, all of these different things that it can do for you on the mental level and the physical level as well, what it can do for you spiritually, like the siddhis that can awaken. But the focus is never on that. It's actually like, how is this awakening, a deepening of my love relationship with the Lord, with the divine, and awakening that relationship inside. And so that's what Atma Kriya Yoga is in a nutshell. And yeah, we can go much deeper into it, but I just give an introduction.
Yeah, and I think we will. But just so that we're going at a pace that hopefully any listeners can keep up with, I want to make sure to point out a couple quick things. So you mentioned siddhi. So just in case we hit different Sanskrit terms that maybe need to be defined for people, siddhi would be like a power that's awakened, like a latent capacity, which could be kind of magical, but could also be like a distraction on the path towards the real purpose. Mm-hmm.
Thanks for bringing that in. Yeah, absolutely. Siddhis are yogic superpowers. And, I think a lot of people, when we start, me for sure, I wanted to bend spoons. Like as a child, that was like very much a goal, is to have those little miraculous experiences or like have things awaken. But absolutely, as you say, I can see it a lot actually in the Kundalini Yoga community. People have like, I won't go into too much detail, but there's a lot of sort of interesting things you can see and experience that awaken for people. And it's not about being attached, as you say, to that kind of benefit or power that you can gain from the practice, but the true power, which is to have that communion, have that yoga, that union. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I won't go into little miracles I've seen once or twice, but it's interesting. Yeah. Okay, well, just for now, let's keep going. So you mentioned Babaji. So Babaji is like represented in Paramahansa Yogananda's autobiography of a yogi. So just like the Bhagavad Gita, those two are great entry resources, if any. And I'm sure, like you said, many listeners, whoever finds this through either of our channels, might already be very familiar. But just in case someone's looking for some introduction, it's both entry level and eternally ever deepening material. So if people want to explore the Gita, Bhagavad Gita, or Autobiography of a Yogi by Yogananda, those are 2 great ways to get a little bit deeper. And so then from Babaji, through these instructions to your guru, came this Atma Kriya Yoga practice that is entirely rooted in the loving devotion of Bhakti. So, and you said you could go deeper into that. So I want to invite you to do that, because I'm also like, an obvious question it brings up is, well, then how do you do that? Or like, so
Sure.
it sounds great. And then what's next?
Great. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
it's funny you bring back Babaji in because, for some time, in the beginning, you're trying to map out the things. You haven't listened to all the satsangs. You haven't, so you're like, okay, Babaji, Kriya, Bhakti, those things in my life, like, I like these things. And Guruji, he explains that actually when Lord Krishna was leaving the planet, his Shakti, his energetic potency was so prevalent that if he left and took it with him, it would, we enter into this sort of darker time on earth about 5,000 years ago, Kali Yuga. He decided to leave his Shakti here, and because but I'm not going to go into too much detail, but essentially he puts it inside Mahavatar Babaji. So Babaji has this Shakti of an avatar, of an incarnation of the divine on earth. And so he's holding this love for the planet, and he's holding it secret in the Himalayas until the earth is ready to receive it and to start practicing it. Because these times it's not about just, having the external relationship with the divine, but very much awakening that inside. And so, so that's a little connection point there.
I want to bookmark there, just because we study all traditions in this and many different approaches to knowledge in this podcast and our institute. So I just want to bookmark that what you just named is actually a very universal principle or idea, that there can be some sort of people or person who just their presence on the planet directly impacts the state of affairs of the planet itself and human civilization as a whole, just in relation to the degree of cultivation or righteousness or the energy field of any given being or group of beings, usually a smaller quantity of people, if more than one, and usually not widely known, sort of secret, hard to access. But that idea that there are these people or like masters of some sort that hold this avatar level energy for the sake of the whole planet and humanity at large is a pretty common universal theme across a number of different esoteric traditions. So I just wanted to bookmark that real quick and then keep going.
Thank you. Yeah, it's the understanding that when Dharma is out of balance, when there's an increase of our Dharma, then there's that can be a divine incarnation that comes to sort things out for us. I was watching this meme the other day, and it was really funny. It was this little cartoon of Shiva and Vishnu, and it's understood that like a lot of like great asuras, great demons, in history, they're actually really advanced yogis. So they do this cultivation of siddhi through like standing on one leg for like hundreds of years, and all of these of it. And then they go to one of the gods and they're like, hey, like, can I have a boon? I've worshipped you for thousands of years. And they're like, and in the meme he's like, Shiva's like, mere bolo no, like I said no. And then he's like, please, and he's like, no. And then he's like, okay. And and you see that a lot actually in the Vedic history of like how these great demons, that were terrorizing and that were greedy for it's actually just the ego, it represents our own arrogance, pride, and ego, like do these practices to gain this power, and the divine is obliged, but then it's like the leela, it's the play that then he has to come and sort things out himself and bring justice back. So it's this constant play.
That's beautiful. I love hearing the teachings through stories like that personally. Can I ask you, before you do keep going, just because there's another term you mentioned, dharma and adharma, could you just define that, of what do you mean by dharma and what does it mean for the opposite to happen?
Sure. So dharma, thank you so much for picking up on the Sanskrit. Dharma essentially is a righteous way of living. There's different principles by which we can understand and establish, what is a righteous way of being and not, just to keep it very simple.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Perfect.
I think
Okay, so yeah, what were
if
you
we
gonna
were
say?
to go a little bit deeper with that, everybody has a personal dharma. Like everybody's born with something that they're here to uncover and to live out. And it's important for us all actually to really sit with what is my dharma, what is my service to the world, what is my offering here, or what am I coming to bring? It could be being a mother, it could be being a teacher, But also there's a collective dharma, swadharma, which is to uncover that relationship with the divine and to realize the self and realize God.
So it's like there's universal dharma as a principle of righteousness, but rooted in self-realization in the highest sense. But then it's also like unique to each individual, that this like universal principle of righteousness of dharma also translates to discovering and fulfilling your own mission.
Exactly, yes. They fit in together. It's like the micro and the macro. And, just to bring in the notion of self-realization, in our tradition, Guruji speaks of something, higher than that, which is God realization. And it's slightly different in that sense, where the anubhava, the realization that you are immersing yourself in, is not one that is related just to the soul, just to the self, but to the self of that self, to God. Just like the waves in the ocean, you realize that you are the wave, you are that soul, you are that individuated particle, but that you are completely and entirely submerged with God.
Yeah, I don't want to distract us because I feel like I keep interjecting on this much larger topic that I want to let you really go into. But as one last thing, just because you're bringing it up, this makes me really curious. So it's called Atma Kriya, but Atma relates, I would guess, to Atman as in the soul or
Absolutely, yeah.
self, true self. But then you're talking about going beyond the Atman to what, and I've heard many different systems and languages around this, but there's, in the most basic sense of what I've heard, I guess mostly from these yogic traditions, is a languaging around Atman and Brahman. And I don't know if that's related to what you were just saying, but yeah.
Yeah, so it's a great point. Like in Atma Kriya Yoga, the way that it works, is through our own effort, which can lead us to attaining self-realization. But there's what's known as Shaktipat in Atma Kriya. That is this initiation. It's blessing. It's the transmission of grace of the masters. And this Shaktipat, it awakens that potential for God realization that is beyond just me knowing myself and relying on my efforts. It's I do my efforts, but then there's that extra piece where God comes and gives his grace. And that in itself is that kind of final step. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I'll leave it be for now. So I just want to invite you to, if anything you didn't finish sharing, to just fully dive into, and also to keep painting a picture for us of how does the Atma Kriya Yoga and Bhakti actually work. What does it involve, practically speaking? Like, what are you doing? How are you doing it? If that makes sense.
Sure, yeah. So it talks about the 9 forms of bhakti. Like the course itself is a 2-day course where you get all the techniques and then you practice for the rest of your life. So essentially, if you feel called to, but once you start, it's so enjoyable that you don't really ever consider stopping, kind of thing. At least from my personal experience. But essentially, it goes through the 9 forms of bhakti. So it's a journey of starting. This is something that was outlined and given by Prahlad Maharaj. He was the son of a great demon known as Hiranyakashipu, but he was a great devotee of Sriman Narayana. And so he's this little boy who lived at an ashram. When he was in his mother's womb, all the devas wanted to kill him because he was the son of this great demon that was taking a lot of power. But he was kept in an ashram of this sage called Narada Muni. And while he was in the womb, he was getting instructed on Bhakti Yoga. And Narada said to the devas, like, don't kill him. I will make him he will be one of the greatest bhaktas. So then Prahlad Maharaji shares with the world the 9 steps, the 9 forms of bhakti. And the first is to listen to the stories of the saints, to listen to the divine stories, and also to the name of the Lord. The second, you are immersing yourself in that name, in that story. You're remembering it. And it's kind of like when I give the course, sometimes we speak about, like somebody meets someone and they have a first date. There's like that spark. And then you're thinking about it constantly. You're thinking about that person. So it's still the same with God in that sense. And then Kirtana Bhakti, which is to sing and to chant and to share about the glories of the Lord. So you're telling your friends about this amazing person you met, kind of on that level. And all of these 3 forms of bhakti, you're still focused on yourself. And then you come into Pada Seva, which is expressed through Om chanting, actually. It's activated through Om chanting, this form of bhakti. It's to serve the divine within the other. And then we go on the journey through Archana, which is ritualistic worship. You're going into worshipful, like the form of bhakti that's awakened through the act of prostration, like this kind of mood of like service. And then you get to the last 3, which are really interesting. So these are all, just to go explain what I'm talking about, like these bhaktis are what is awakened through the different kriyas in Atma Kriya, the different techniques. Then you get to Dasya Bhakti, which is, in my spiritual name, there's the Das Dasi, which is in Bhakti, it's this position of a constant role of service. You're always positioning yourself in service to. So it's the form of bhakti that awakens this relationship of service with the divine or with the spiritual master, if someone has a living master or non-living master. And then after that, you go so deep in that relationship of service that all you want to do is be close to that person and love. And it goes beyond this hierarchical expression between master and disciple or God and devotee, but it goes into this relationship known as Sakya. Sakya is friendship. And so you go beyond this kind of hierarchical expression and you become friends with the teacher, become friends with God, but you know exactly what is right for you to do or not, and you're just in that flow of expression. And then the very final stage you can't attain through your own efforts. It's Atma Nivedana, which is to submerge yourself completely. Well, it's not even you who's doing it. It's by the grace of the Master or of God that you are able to submerge yourself completely in that love and become one with that love. So that's kind of how Atma Kriya expresses bhakti through each technique. It takes you on that inner journey through your practice. It takes you through those stages.
Wow, that's powerful and very poetically expressed as well. So thank you for sharing that. What is the Om chanting component? Is it literally just chanting the syllable Om?
Yeah, it's such an amazing practice. Essentially, you gather in 2 concentric circles. There's one group facing in, one group facing out. And it's a self and distant healing practice. So usually for about 45 minutes, we just chant Om, and everybody chants in their own harmony. It's not a musical performance. Everybody just meditates, chanting this vibration. And it is so powerful because it has, the blessing of Babaji and of Guruji and all the masters really, whichever master someone that comes is connected to and beyond. It brings this capacity to pull out karma and density, not just from the individuals, but also there's a little pot in the middle where you can write the names of people or places. And you basically pray for those people, and it removes anything dense from them. But it also has a benefit 2.5-mile radius, or chanted with devotion a 5-mile radius, at clearing the environment, the animal, anything dense in the water, and any tension on the human level. It's a huge healer and clearer energetically. So it's super powerful. And there's Om chantings all over the world, and it's just a very simple practice. It's always sort of community based, and anybody who wants to be a facilitator just has to attend 9 and take a small training. So it's a really amazing seva. It does pada seva. So pada means feet, and seva is service. So you're serving the lotus feet of the Lord in the heart of each person. You're serving that aspect of love that is awake in all beings, because it's a practice that you don't do for yourself. You do it for others. Some people come and they om, and it feels so nice to just listen and meditate. But actually, you have to keep chanting, like you're doing it as an act of service. So it's a very nice practice.
I wanted to ask a couple questions about the work that you do with this tradition. Like, one is, I'm curious about the inclusive or universalist component of that. Like, how do y'all relate to multiple different paths, traditions, influences, teachers, deities, approaches, etc.? Does that make sense?
Totally, it's a great question. So the first, one of the key sentences of the Vedas is Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. The truth is one, but the wise speak of it in many different ways. And it's this understanding that we met in a very sort of intertribal or intercultural altar with different spiritual traditions, and it's this understanding that there's only one truth, really. Guru Nanak, for example, this great master, he's the founder of Sikhism, essentially. He says, Ek Onkar, there's only one truth, there is only one. So it's just this access point of speaking of that reality, of speaking of that truth from one perspective, right? And in Hinduism, essentially, the other term for it is Sanatana Dharma, which is the eternal Dharma, the eternal righteous truth, the eternal way of living. And it's beyond any sort of religious fixed position. It's a truth that's true for all. But I find it's important when we are on this path to find our path, and to find our practice, and to find our way of relating to the divine, for it to get deeper. And so that's just Bhakti Yoga, is that way of relating to the divine and giving our full concentration on that relationship.
Yeah. I'm really glad you mentioned the kind of paradox there, because it's, on one hand, a very universal perspective, and on the other hand, taking a completely universal perspective sometimes can also, if it's done sort of prematurely, manifest as like a totally open-ended new agey approach, which may be fine, but it doesn't always have any sort of like practice or discipline or structure or learning. It can be ungrounded, disintegrated, not manifesting in your life, your daily life, your relationships and challenges and choices and so on. Whereas, like, you're bringing up finding, and even the language around like a narrow path, it's like even finding like a particular focus point to go deep with, I think can be really valuable. And having teachers can be incredibly valuable part of that, not just practices, but community and wise people, elders, guides. And even if you are blessed to know many teachers, having a direct personal relationship, and kind of like a home base somewhere where you're actually like committing to something and devoting your energy to a longer term connection somewhere, I think can be really valuable as well, because it goes beyond like those roles and into the real human, or just the real lived experiential level of that. So yeah. And I want to ask you, so the universalism component makes sense, and I guess I'm just curious, like in the practices that you do with this bhakti emphasis, I'm wondering what your relationship is from that angle with nature, with like the divinity or spirit or importance of nature and the natural world and forces. Yeah, maybe you want to just take it from there.
It's so interesting that you bring that up, because before committing to this path, so this path is one where there's no, you can drink cacao, but there's nothing beyond that, just to be very simple about it. And it was a big dilemma for me before getting initiated. I really wanted to have Paramahamsa Vishwananda as my guru and to commit to this path and, get really deep into it. But I wasn't quite ready to let go of working with altars that had different plants on the table, or, different expressions, right? Or, diving in with different ceremonial practices. And that was a huge dilemma for me, because it was something that I felt so intertwined with. And I sat with it and I was like, why is it that I feel so sort of attached to this? And it was like because of the connection with Mother Nature. It was because of this drive of like, I want to be closer to the waters. I want to be closer to the earth. I want to have that strong relationship. And it was really funny because I was doing a vision quest, and I was only in my second year, and I was about to go on my third, but then I was at the end of a 10-day commentary with Guruji, and I was like, if he's not it for me, like, I don't know what is. Like, it was like this point of which there was a fork in the road, and I didn't know where to turn, and I was like, oh, but if I get this initiation, I won't complete the water, I won't have had that. And he initiated me. It happened very, it kind of happened, and he gave me the name of a river. So I was like, okay, we're good on that front. But it was interesting because it was just after my initiation that I truly started to feel nature in my lived day-to-day experience. And the Vedic tradition, at least how we practice it, it brings in all the elements. We do yagna, which is a Vedic fire ceremony, and here you're working very tangibly with the different elements. And one of our practices that we do on a daily basis is puja abhishekam, which is the offering, in a very simplistic way, of flour and water to the divine, to our deity. But also we bathe the deity every day. And if you want to take it to a higher level, you're bathing in the 5 elements. So you're bathing with the water, the ghee, the curd, the sugar, and each of those elements represents different elements in nature and then different elements in the body. And so we're always engaged in that connection. And they do a lot of practice to Bhudevi, who's Mother Earth. And so there is that very continued and lived experience of relationship with Mother Earth, thankfully, because that would have been really challenging for me otherwise. But yeah.
I'm actually fascinated, and I think that our listeners might be getting tired of hearing this at this point. But my dissertation is on the elements across cultures. So I'm actually interested to hear a little bit more if you want to go into it. I don't know if you know the exact correspondences and things like this, but I'd be curious to hear what the actual puja with the elements and the symbolism of that is.
Absolutely, yeah. So in essence, you're doing the practice. You have like what we have universally in all traditions. You have the sankalpa, you have your intention, and you have a deity, ideally that's been blessed and awakened. And you're bringing into you have the fire, the incense, the water, the flowers. You're working with all the different elements throughout this trajectory. It's a practice that can be done from like 15 minutes to an hour a day. And I can't say that I should know this, but I can't say that I can tell you in detail which aspect of the ego or the mind or the element that's being balanced as you're doing the pouring. But it's in the puja manual. I could, pick it up quickly, but it's essentially you're working through these different elements, and you're not just doing it for yourself, because the puja or the practice, the kriya, whatever it is, it's also balancing and harmonizing the elements in the environment and bringing things, into a state of balance. And I just want to ask, like, I'm fascinated. We didn't get the chance to talk in depth. Like, tell me a little bit about your dissertation, because I'm also studying in parallel, so we found that quite interesting.
Yeah, sure. I got into a whole flow here with my line of questioning. You're just providing so much fascinating information that I'm enthralled and could keep going. And before I answer your question, I also want to point out, you said like that the deity's been blessed and awakened, like that, and it's just another point, just like the idea of kind of a being or beings in the world that help hold the balance of humanity. In the same way, this is also a very universal thing. So I just wanted to point that out, that it's maybe to modern materialistically minded people could sound superstitious or something like that, but it's actually a very universal principle in so many different traditions. Like you've talked about the Maya, you've talked about, and we haven't talked about others. There's the Egyptian, there's many different traditions where there's this sense that there may be places, objects, items that are like power objects, or that are alive, that are imbued with the ancestors, or that have an indwelling spirit, that they're not just like a dead symbol, but when you go to that temple or to that statue and so on, to that place of offering, around the world, there's this understanding that some places have this felt presence that's imbued into them, to where that's an animated, living presence of a particular type or of a particular entity or energy that's like represents its own particular thing. So I just wanted to reinforce that. And I have more questions for you, but I'm gonna try and answer. So you're wondering about my research. What were you asking?
Yeah, I'm super curious, just on a personal basis, not even for the podcast.
Yeah, totally. Well, I don't know if I can do it justice tonight, but just to give you like a quick overview. So a big part of the academic side of my work is, which is just one part of it, is technically speaking, like my PhD is in Jungian psychology. But the research that I'm doing in this phase, which is like way past all the coursework and is actually about to be finished this summer, the whole degree program, and my dissertation published as a book and so on, and it's going to be peer reviewed scholarly research that's available online and so on. And the topic is really related to alchemy. And it's related to the elements of nature, the 5 elements, which in Sanskrit would be called the Mahabhutas. But it's related to how these elements appear in all these different traditions all around the world throughout time, from prehistory to modern day. And it's also using that knowledge to then help redefine this idea of alchemy, because people have this prejudice that alchemy is like some medieval European charlatanism about turning metal into gold, which it's just not, right? It's really about the elements and transmutation. And that's really all alchemy is, in my view, is that it's transmutation can be symbolized through a particular system related to immortality, to gold, to the sun. There's many ways that, to elixirs and all kinds of ways that people talk about it, but really it's the transformation, but recognizing that the material being transformed from one state or degree to another is the same material all along. And it's not really material, it's soul, which actually comes back to a comment I wanted to make about what you shared, which is that you were pointing out the associations in the puja. But what I heard was that it's like there's associations with the specific substance you're using in the offering, whether it's sugar or ghee and so on. But that's like the base level association of the material that you're using to make the offering. But then there's all these layers of correspondence, and not only does it correspond to the elements like in your body, but also in your psyche, right? Absolutely. And so that's how my dissertation works for a psychology degree. Is I'm looking at how all of these alchemical traditions from around the world since the beginning of time have had a sophisticated psychological understanding and component to them in relation to the elements and transmutation. And it goes deeper from there, but that's a little bit of an overview.
Thank you for sharing. That's so fascinating. And I guess, like, you know, it can be understood in that sort of on that mental level, but also there's the lived experience, right? Like what does it feel tangibly like to be in communion and in touch with these elements? And yeah, it's so interesting.
And the lived experience, rather than just the concept of the process of transmutation, even when it's not just a physical relationship to the elements of nature, but when it's in relation to the transformation of your soul.
Absolutely. Oh, cool. It's like, it reminds me of this verse from the Bhagavad Gita, like speaking of the soul, like it cannot be cut, it cannot be burned, it cannot be, you know, it's beyond this material conception. However, our jiva, like this aspect of the Atma, that is of the soul that's embodied, has this relationship with matter and with the elements, and how the elements are just representative of something on a much larger cosmic scale.
Well, I'm really glad you bring that up, because that's exactly the kind of imagery that's relevant for the type of study I'm talking about, because what you just described is very alchemical language and imagery, because it relates to the qualities of Akasha and ether as a fifth element that's totally intangible and it's immaterial. So that correlation between that and the soul is a whole nother topic, but it has to do with how the elements themselves are transmuted, that the elements themselves are densities on a spectrum. And so even what you talk about with like going beyond the personal soul, I think could on some level be very relevant to this idea of the refined, like the alchemical refinement, to where the soul is more and more ethereal to the point where it's completely dissolved in universal, you know, oneness, if that's what you want to call it, beyond what we think of as self. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you know, I shared just before we came on that, like, I'm in the depths of studying, and I'm studying my spiritual teacher's philosophy as his Siddhanta, which is like his conclusion. And what I found very interesting when I got into Bhakti Yoga is this understanding that actually the way that it's conceived in Bhakti is that actually you always retain your individuality as a soul. That you are like this carved out piece that is part of God, but that always has its own individuality and never merges. So that there's always that Veda Sahishnu Abheda, this oneness, that oneness with duality.
Mm-hmm.
And so I find that understanding of the soul, like for me in the beginning, I was mind boggled, because I came from more Buddhist understanding, and, you know, it's about, you know, kind of going back into that state of nothingness, if I'm not mistaken,
Mm-hmm.
or that complete
emptiness of the Buddhist. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and they literally use the word anatma to mean like no self. But the thing is, I'm really glad what you bring up, because my understanding from an alchemical perspective is that it totally allows room for both, including what you're saying very much can be a part of what I was trying to describe in terms of the transmutation process, because a lot of alchemical traditions have to do with like a descent and ascent. and like a cycle of descending and returning. And so part of the purpose of separating from our origin in oneness, let's say, is so that we can cultivate this individuality, so that when we return to that union with the source we come from, we remember ourselves as one with that origin, and yet we are now this individuated expression of it, if that makes sense, and retain that. And that's also very much psychologically relevant, like that applies also to psychic processes of individuation and separating to return and so on.
I love that. It's so beautiful to think about, because obviously there's a plan for each one. And the way that I was explained, the way it was explained to me, is that we are all this part of divinity, and we go and we get carved like a piece of wood that gets carved and carved through all our different experiences until we become a flute. And eventually, when that flute is so hollow and empty of itself, empty of its attachment to this material world, of its concept of me, myself, and I, and it goes beyond that, then it becomes a perfect instrument for the Lord to play through. And so at the end, we are all these different carved flutes, but we all have our unique melody that can be sung through. And I just love this. Like for me, when I heard that, and it's similar to what you're saying, it's super beautiful expression.
Yeah, it almost feels like there's like this integration, like a merging with your true self, that you're removing the ego, you're removing the obstructions, and you're still left with like a unique creative expression of the universe that's still moving through. Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you. Wow. Let's see. We have time maybe for a couple last topics before we wrap up. I was excited to hear that you used to do capoeira. Of all the things we could talk about. Why don't we do this? So I asked you questions about the inclusivity of your lineage and the relationship to nature, and you mentioned that it was a challenge to let go of your work with some maybe more plant-based traditions or practices. And I want to welcome you to share about that if you'd like to. I think you mentioned before we started specific experiences you'd had and trainings you'd had, like in South America and things like that. So if you want to share a little more on that topic while we're, different indigenous traditions, we could do some of that.
Yeah, I mean, the work with the plants is so transformational and so immersive and so amazing. Like, you live your whole life, and then one day you find out that there's like this whole other realm that you can access, and everybody can, access that. And it kind of, for me, it was this big connection to like this power that I didn't, as a child, I always had this feeling that there was something magic in the air, but I didn't know what. And then that for me was like, oh my God, here it is. And then I constructed a whole world around that where, there was a bit of a reliance on said experience to feel that inner state. But fortunately for me, like my sadhana, became very serious when I started working with plants. So it was always like this journey that was going kind of hand in hand. And actually, I got to visit the Yamanawa in their home, in 2019 in the village, and then I went back and did a deeper study with the plants where you fast from a lot of food, you can't drink water for a month, there's like specific rituals and so on. And I found still that in that I was looking for something. I was really trying to find something that was outside of myself, that was in that lived experience. And so I went to different tribes, more North America, with the desert in Mexico, and we did pilgrimages. And there it was like getting clear, okay, there's this thing that I'm touching onto that's getting closer and closer. And after reading and immersing myself a bit more, I'm like, okay, what I'm looking for is called self-realization. Okay, got it. Okay. So it's kind of fine-tuning a little bit the search. And you mentioned elixirs, and I was very fortunate to come across some self-realized teachers, 2 people, that worked with ceremonies that go beyond the plant realm and go into the alchemical world. And those experiences were so transformational for me and so powerful, that I had this a visionary state that was beyond what any plant gave me. It was so crystalline, and it was so intertwined with, I don't want to go too woo-woo, but like past life. And, like it was very, very, very deep that in those ceremonies, I was able to find Babaji. Like I had this very tangible experience of Babaji, Mahavatar Babaji that we mentioned earlier. And after that, it was like very clear for me that, the path was, whatever it was Kriya, it was this relationship. And alongside that, I had actually met Guruji, Paramahamsa Vishwananda, before these ceremonial works. I had met him, and they say the first time you meet your teacher, your satguru, he gives you everything you need in that first moment. And I remember I would go into the hall and he would speak, and as soon as he would open his mouth, I would fall asleep, and I was trying to keep my eyes open, like I was so submerged by this energy, and I would wake up as soon as he would end speaking. And I spoke to someone about it. I was like, is it normal? And they're like, have you had prasad from him? Like, did you take the blessed, he offers sometimes amrit, which is this like sugar water, essentially blessed nectar during Navaratri. It's the celebration of the Divine Mother. Have you taken some from him? I said, no. So she says, go. So after the talk one evening, I went up to him. He poured me this one drop in my hand. And when I sat back down, it was like this explosion happened inside where, he did a tweet actually yesterday where he was speaking about like bliss, love, like God's love, how it's so painful, but so blissful, but it's full of suffering, but it's also joy. And it's, all of these contradictions of what like it is to have an experience of, God's love in that sense. And I had this experience where I was just like screaming and crying inside and laughing and like everything happening at the same time. And I remember like that was stronger for me than anything I had experienced in the ceremonies that I was looking for. But it took me a few years to understand that, because the attachment was so there.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. I wanted to say that it's really, really funny because you went from ceremony work to an alchemical elixir to realizing even though the elixir was in a whole nother level, then none of that could compare to Amrit, which literally means elixir. So I just wanted to point that out because it's funny.
Yeah.
But this, go ahead.
Guruji, I don't want to present him in this way of like, I don't like speaking, especially to new people about his sort of his spiritual gifted side of like, what he can, but he can twist things in, speaking of alchemy, he can twist things. And there's a devotee from Scotland who, the amazing thing about my lineage is that like, you would never imagine, like we're all different people in a room, like you'd never imagine we're part of the same lineage because everybody's so different. So there's this guy from Scotland who's very like Scottish, like he's just like, I don't know how to explain it. He's just like a very Scottish guy. And once he bumped into Guruji at the airport, and like Guruji was usually, he has, people around him, but for the first time he bumps into him on his own. And so they happen to like go on the same flight, and they're both going to England. Guruji has family in England, so I guess maybe he was visiting them. And they find a way to sit near each other. So they're kind of on either side of an aisle. And, we don't touch alcohol or anything like that in our lineage. And there's a trolley that goes, and I guess this guy's past some scars, his past attachments, they ignite. And so he sees this trolley and he says to Guruji, like, oh, Guruji, like, fancy me a wee bit of whiskey. And in that moment, Guruji smiles and looks at him and sticks his hand into they had just sat on the plane, they were just taking off. They hadn't been there for long. He sticks his hand into like the compartment, in the seat in front with like whatever's in there. And he pulls out a bottle of whiskey and he hands it to him and he's like, you could have asked for Amrit. And I really think like that's story hit me really deep because I was like, did you ever try it? And he's like, no, it's just there. I was like, it could very well be Amrit, like this divine nectar that gives you immortality. And so it's this idea of like, be aware of what you're asking for. And for me,
Wow.
I was asking for experience for many years, like spiritual experience. But now I'm just asking for love and service because I've been shown over and over that that's what is, that's what matters. So yeah, just that little story.
Beautiful. Yeah. Well, and even what you described as like falling asleep or going under, there's like this going under that happens with our normal waking consciousness that sometimes can't stay alert when listening to some transmission. And from some teachers, I think that that's actually, there's some effect on our nervous system that we're used to being in a particular state all the time, that we can't really be in a heightened state of alertness and wakefulness and attentiveness unless we're tense. And then when all of our tensions removed and we're totally at peace, then the only way that our nervous system is accustomed to responding to that might be to fall asleep. And so there's like this other complementary transmission that goes with that through the prasad, the like sweet offering in the teaching session that you can eat to like somehow then awaken this other part of your alertness to actually stay there and pay attention. So yeah, that's interesting. What was it like bringing some of those, because you're still connected to native traditions. I think I saw a post of yours that sounded kind of fun where you saw your teacher after you went to Peru and he asked if you connected with Pachamama.
We were in Peru together.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was really cool actually because I had never been to Peru, and that was kind of like this thing on my list. When you have your shamanic checklist, like okay, one day we'll go to Peru and be with this specific lineage, and yeah, it's amazing how like he fulfills all those little things. And I was in Peru on pilgrimage with him, and it was really beautiful actually because we had ceremony with some traditional altars, and they did a Pachamama offering ceremony, and he was sat there, and it was just like watching the masters, like true masters. They're so deeply humble that it breaks your heart, like seeing him with this like 98-year-old like Altomi Sayok, she's higher than a shaman in her tradition, and just seeing their love exchange and like the sweetness. And it was in that ceremony that he said, like, it's so similar. All this, they have the bell, they have the candle, they have the offering to Mother Nature, to the divine, whatever expression. It's all beautiful. It's all valid. It's all that act of devotion. And yeah, it was really sweet seeing. And she's like this tiny little lady, and she saw him, and she was like, she asked like in Spanish to the person, she's like, you ask him if he can hug? And he was like, of course. And like it's like this super sweet embrace and moment. And for me, it was like, oh, like these different traditions coming together. But he said in that moment, I had this conversation with Guruji. He said to me, he's like, oh, did you commune with Pachamama? And I was like, yeah, we went to this amazing kocha. Like we had this amazing hike. I was going to tell him the story. And he was like, I was like, yeah, we went to super sacred places. Like, all places are. He basically was like, he looked at me in the eyes and he was like, all places are sacred, all people are sacred, and it's time to find that inside of yourself. And for me, that was mind-blowing because often we associate specific things as, and I find the masters, they're here to remind us that light, that love is in everything, is in everyone, and to really start living that experience of like what that means.
Totally.
I just want to, sorry to jump in, but I just want to share, like, I just find it amazing that we were together, I think it was February last year in Guatemala. And do you want to share about that?
No, you share it first.
We were at dinner, I think we were having pizza actually, and I shared that my spiritual master's lineage, there's a big ashram that's being opened in Elmira, and your father lives in Elmira, isn't that right?
Yep. Yeah, it was a pretty hilarious and mind-boggling synchronicity actually, because we're in Guatemala of all places, with the Mayans and with um, another mutual teacher, Maestro Manuel, and we're down there and the Waya, the Sacred Fire, and it's like, as you said, just out to dinner, and my father lives in the middle of nowhere. And that's what totally blew my mind about it, is like he lives in this town in the middle of nowhere in upstate New York, and I have to drive all the way out there to visit him when I go to the East Coast. And so I didn't know that there was anything there, like other than a pub and a grocery store that wasn't even close to his house. And of all places in Guatemala, I find out that your teacher and your lineage is building like this huge temple, like a headquarters there,
Mm-hmm.
and a temple. And we even have another mutual friend from a totally unrelated setting, who I call Mariah Nikunja, I believe is her spiritual name, who's also connected to that temple in Elmira and now in the same tradition as you, but had come to trainings that we organized here with our nonprofit like many years ago. So there's just some fascinating overlaps. Yeah.
Yeah, it's unbelievable, like how, the world is so broad, but it just keeps getting smaller and smaller. And yeah, it's a really beautiful. You went to the temple, right? You visited.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I went to one morning session. I couldn't stay long, but yeah, it was
They
beautiful.
just had a 72-hour Vedic fire ceremony. And yeah, I just like that community in upstate New York. They're super like sadhana driven, and they have shalagrams, which are these very special stones that are supposed to be that are an incarnation of Lord Vishnu. And every Ekadashi, like this special fasting day a month, they do Abhishekam, like this ritual on all I think it's 3,000 shalagrams. So they're really like, it's really beautiful, which purifies like a state. I would imagine it has a very powerful effect on the environment. And yeah, that actually, speaking of like murtis and enlivening, like the spiritual potency of a specific ritual object, I went to the Prana Pratishta, like the awakening of those deities in Elmira, and it was like one of the most epic things I've seen, because the aspect of the divine Guruji said to be worshipped there is known as Lord Nrsimhadev, Narsimha, which is the lion man form of Vishnu that comes to like kill the demons, and restore dharma, restore righteousness. So it's an epic place. I love it there.
Yeah, yeah, I saw it. I was in there and I was like, I don't know what the locals are gonna think, but I like it. Um, yeah, it's great. It's great. So maybe last question or second to last. I wanted to just ask you, because I think it's so fascinating how some of these different traditions of the world are interacting and also traveling, as you bring up, and you helped welcome the sacred fire of the Maya and the Wixarika or Huichol, and bring teachers to the Arabian Peninsula, which is your home. And I don't know if you want to share at all about like that work or that experience and what that's been like.
Sure, yeah. Super beautiful blessing. I actually, since you mentioned Maestro Manuel, a few years ago, I asked him, like, Maestro, I would really like to bring these different ways, like the healing ways, to my land, to where I'm from. And I think some blessings in there, because it's just unfolded naturally that these different elders showed interest in coming to the Middle East. And it's amazing how much just, a few days visit of theirs can have such a ripple effect, right? Because they have practices and techniques and lineage of healing that is so ancient. And actually this year, the Mayans will come back, hopefully in October. And when they come, it's so beautiful. Our focus is mostly on women's work. And, she comes, Nana Marina brings a midwife, and we speak a lot about, women's ways with, pregnancy, delivery, and they give very deep hands-on treatment. And we make a fire, and it's a fire of gratitude in the desert that we always have. And it's very beautiful how it just works so well with our culture here in the Gulf, but also it's it works very well. It's so respectful to all traditions. And I remember taking Nana to the mosque in Abu Dhabi, and she was just sharing like words of her father, Tata Pedro, and like how it's all one love. The most important thing is just love. It's all one love.
I don't know if anyone who's still listening has given up on the original idea of us actually translating Sanskrit words, but you had mentioned that the temple in New York is sadhana focused, and I just remembered that I never translated that one. So just so people know, sadhana, practice, the spiritual practice. I don't know if there's any elucidation you would add to that, but
I would just say, good way to bring in this before we close the podcast is, the importance of spiritual practice to grow and committing to one discipline, whether it's Atma Kriya. For us, the most important is japa, like constant repetition of the name. That's what's said for our time to be the most effective. Or whatever form of yoga you engage in, to have that and to bring in devotion into it. I feel like that's probably the most important thing is to in these times that we're going through so much transformation, that we commit to our disciplines, and whatever they are, whatever lineage they're from.
Indeed. Couldn't have said it better. I think that's a perfect place to end. I don't know if you say sat or shanti, or do you have a more appropriate way of saying aho or amen or something?
We say Jai Guru Dev.
Jai Guru Dev.
Jai Guru Dev. Yes. Yeah.
JJ. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Mariam, for joining today, and this has been a real pleasure.